Welcome to the SALS video on cellular respiration. After watching this video, learners will be able to briefly explain the role of ATP in the body, differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, describe the use of lipids and proteins in cellular respiration, and explain how phosphocreatine is used to produce energy. Let's start by briefly explaining the role of ATP in the body. ATP is a chemical that our body uses in order to store energy until it's needed for various processes that occur in our body. So let's look at the structure of that chemical. This is an image of ATP. It's made up of three parts. The first is a sugar. The second is a base. Together, the sugar and the base make up adenosine. The other portion of the ATP is these three phosphates here. Because we have three phosphates, this is a triphosphate. In the end, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The key to this chemical is that the bonds between the phosphates are high-energy chemical bonds. We can actually store energy within these chemical bonds that can then later be released in order to perform various functions in the body. The key chemical concept to this is to remember that whenever you break a chemical bond, energy can be released. If we were to break one of these bonds, pulling the phosphate off, we would be left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and the free phosphate here. By breaking that bond, we've released energy. That energy can be used, as mentioned, in various processes of the body. One example would be in muscle contraction. Muscle contraction is the movement of muscles, but that movement requires energy, and that energy comes from the breaking of this bond in the ATP. But then where does our body actually get the ATP from? To look at that, we have to think about the process of how do we make ATP? In the end, our body recycles this ADP and that free phosphate and can actually attach that phosphate back onto the ADP, forming a new bond. The key here to remember is that because there's a new bond formed, it took energy in order to make that bond. In fact, the same amount of energy that would be given off when that bond was broken in order to perform some function in our body. Where does that energy come from? That energy comes from the food that we eat, things like carbohydrates and lipids and proteins that we get through our diet, through eating foods like are shown here. We'll start here by talking about the major chemical that we use in our bodies in order to get energy, and that is carbohydrates. And we're going to focus on one major carbohydrate, which is glucose. So now let's differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism by looking at a molecule of glucose that would be used within our body in order to make energy. One key thing to remember is that glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. That 6-carbon molecule will go through a series of reactions that occur within the cytoplasm portion of our cells. Those reactions collectively are called glycolysis. Breaking down the term glycolysis, we have glyco, meaning sugar, and lysis, meaning to break down. And so what happens is the glucose, this 6-carbon molecule, will be broken down into pyruvic acid. It's broken down in such a way that we actually end up with 2 pyruvic acids, which are each 3-carbon molecules. So essentially, glycolysis breaks that 6-carbon glucose down into 2 3-carbon pyruvic acids. Through that process, because we're breaking bonds, as we were mentioning earlier, we actually release energy, and we can use that energy to go into making 2 ATPs. 2 ADPs and 2 phosphates, as we saw earlier, will come together forming 2 ATP that can then go around the cell and be used for the various processes that go on. Another chemical that's also produced during glycolysis is NADH. For now, we're not going to look at the NADH, but it will come up again later in the cellular metabolism here in terms of producing more ATP. Glycolysis is a series of reactions. As we mentioned, it occurs in the cytoplasm, and on top of that, it requires no oxygen in order for all those steps of glycolysis to occur. Hence, glycolysis is termed an anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic means no oxygen required. That differs from aerobic metabolism, which we will get into now. Inside the mitochondria of the cell, various processes will occur. The first is Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is a series of reactions where, once the pyruvic acid that has been formed in glycolysis enters into the mitochondria, it will go through a series of reactions that are called the Krebs cycle. Those reactions require oxygen. Oxygen is used as one of the reactants, and the product that is formed is carbon dioxide. This is why we breathe off carbon dioxide. It's because our cells are producing it throughout our body as they produce energy. Through the Krebs cycle, we end up producing 2 more ATP. As we process the pyruvic acid through the Krebs cycle, bonds are being broken and energy is being released such that we can actually make 2 more ATP. Furthermore, we produce more NADH, as well as a second chemical called FADH2 that has similar properties to the NADH. Each of these chemicals, NADH and FADH2, will go into a further process within the mitochondria, the electron transport chain, which are a series of reactions that process the NADH and FADH2 and use oxygen through that process and then produce water as a waste. But in the end, the electron transport chain releases enough energy from that series of reactions that it produces 32 ATP. The Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain both use oxygen. Therefore, they are categorized as aerobic metabolism. Furthermore, both of them occur within the mitochondria. Overall, when both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism are occurring, approximately 36 ATP are being produced that can then go and be used by the cells for various functions. Under certain circumstances, however, aerobic metabolism cannot occur. To use an example of when this would happen, let's first consider going for a walk. When going for a walk, the body is getting enough oxygen into it, being pumped around the cardiovascular system to all of our cells, that glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain are all functioning. You can actually walk for a fairly long time because you're getting enough oxygen. As we were to start to jog or jog faster, our body would be trying to get more and more oxygen around to our tissues, but it's not as efficient at it, and eventually what happens as we run faster and faster, we might end up sprinting. As we sprint down the street, we would not be getting enough oxygen to our tissues such that the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain would actually cease to function. Therefore, we'd be left with only glycolysis functioning because it is the only anaerobic metabolism that our cells can perform. Glucose will still be converted into pyruvic acid, will still make 2 ATP and NADH, however, the Krebs cycle electron transport chain are no longer functioning. Pyruvic acid will start to build up in our muscles, and that would be detrimental for us being able to continue to function. And so the pyruvic acid is quickly converted into lactic acid. Lactic acid can then be stored in our liver as well as our muscles. Over time, if we're sprinting down the road, we will eventually get too tired and stop. We can only do it for so long because we're making very little ATP, as well as producing these acids that will start to affect the pH of our body and not allow our muscles to function as well. When we actually stop running and take a break, the lactic acid can be reconverted back into pyruvic acid, and then because we have enough oxygen, that pyruvic acid can again enter into the Krebs cycle, be converted to NADH, FADH2, and then the NADH, FADH2 from glycolysis and Krebs cycle can enter into the electron transport chain to produce ATP as we saw earlier. This is only after you would slow down with the exercise and have enough oxygen available to your cells. So now let's describe the use of lipids and proteins in cellular respiration. Our cells use glucose as the #1 substrate in order to produce energy. However, let's move these reactions off to the side so we can look at how lipids and proteins are used. The form of lipids that our cells use for energy are triglycerides, which are made up of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. There are 2 processes that occur in order to use glycerol and fatty acids for energy. Glycerol enters into various places within the glycolysis reactions and then continues through forming pyruvic acid through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. In order for fatty acids to be converted to energy, they first must undergo a reaction called beta oxidation. The beta oxidation breaks down the fatty acids into smaller carbon chains that can enter into Krebs cycle at various places. However, the process of beta oxidation also produces ketones. The ketones build up in our body and start to decrease our pH such that our body becomes more acidic. Proteins are used as a third option and sort of a last resort by our body in order to produce energy. The proteins undergo a process called deamination, and after deaminated, those chemicals can enter into various places of the Krebs cycle. One other system that can be used to produce energy is phosphocreatine. Phosphocreatine is specifically used in one type of tissue, muscles. Phosphocreatine is this chemical. It's made up of a phosphate attached to a creatine. The phosphocreatine can be broken down into a phosphate ion as well as a creatine molecule, by breaking the bond between the phosphate and the creatine. In breaking that bond, energy is again released. That energy can go on to be used for making ATP. This system is a very quick system for releasing energy to make ATP. It's used by muscles during very brief exercises, for example, lifting a weight, or the initial few seconds of a sprint. Phosphocreatine is stored in our muscles, waiting to be used under such circumstances. After using the phosphocreatine when recovering from something like exercise, the reverse reaction can occur, where the phosphate is bound to the creatine, and in forming that bond, energy is needed. That energy would come from glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain during recovery from exercise. It requires ATP produced by each of those systems. Now that you've watched this video, you should be able to briefly explain the role of ATP in the body, differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, describe the use of lipids and proteins in cellular respiration, and explain how phosphocreatine is used to produce energy in the muscles. Please keep in touch with SALS by following us on Twitter. Or, to contact us with any questions you have regarding this presentation, please call SALS or email us at sals@durhamcollege.ca.